the bailouts of GM and what happened with the bondholders and that whole Chrysler deal. I mean, the unions ended up on top when they shouldn't have been.
Absolutely. It's one of the things that I think should have been expected, because we're looking at a socialist, fascist kind of mentality in Washington at this point, whereby unions do hold special privilege, and because of that, they basically just wiped out contracts and everything else that these companies had with not only their unions, but also with their customers and stockholders and so forth. Stockholders got cut out even after they have invested billions of dollars into these companies, and all that money was given to the unions.
Right. Let's talk about, in your book you talk about property rights, Dr. Coffman, and that they are the key to liberty and wealth creation. Would you talk about that, please?
Absolutely. One of the things that people do not realize today, actually a major study was done back in the early 2000s, actually not in the 1990s, published in 2001, by a Peruvian by the name of Hernando de Soto. Actually did studies in 15 different nations around the world to find out why capitalism wasn't working after the fall of communism. And what he basically found was the common denominator was a lack of well-secured, legally protected private property rights. And the reason why was that even though people may own their homes and so forth, they never registered them. They were not legally protected in that context. Therefore, banks could not loan them money on their equity. They had no equity value in their homes and their land and so forth. And as a consequence, they could never get the necessary liquidity or capital to start a business or to buy into a business with stock, whatever the case might be. And as a result of that, they stayed impoverished. In fact, the evidence was so clear-cut that it was literally astonishing to those people who actually conducted the research. And many people, the socialists especially, still do not believe the findings of this particular research study that lasted 4 or 5 years. What you don't recognize is that here in the United States, if we buy a piece of property, a home or whatever, usually within a few days to a couple of weeks, your property is registered, it's legally protected, the transfer of ownership has taken place, and so forth. In these third world forming communist nations, regardless of what their source is, it can take years to do through the same process, as many as 100 to 200 bureaucratic steps in order to secure legal title to that house, and actually cost more in the form of bribes and so forth that you have to give each one of these bureaucratic steps than the property and the house did in the first place. And as a consequence, they're never actually registered, legally registered. So therefore, they have no equity value, and the people own it. They paid a few thousand, maybe $10,000 for their house. They could sell it for the same price, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But it has no equity value. They can't borrow against that house to start a business like you and I can. 70% of all the small businesses in the United States were initially started with loans on homes.
Well, I had a small business, and that's what I put up as collateral was my home.
Absolutely. And you don't even think twice about it.
Right.
These third world nations can't do that, literally cannot do that. And what has happened is that Hernando de Soto, when he did this, he estimated, and he had a good way of doing it, it could be plus or minus the figures that he gave, but he estimated that the land value, property value, what he called debt equity, because it's not available for equity, was $9.3 trillion, which is 43 times more than all the loans ever given by the United States for these third world nations and so forth for their foreign aid. They don't need foreign aid if they would have the establishment of private property rights. When the communist bloc fell, when the Soviet Union fell, the capitalists moved in with all of the various components of capitalism except for private property rights. They knew that private property rights would not allow them to rape the economy like they did in Russia and so forth with the mafia. And as a consequence, none of them had these private property rights guaranteed legally, and it has failed miserably. It's failed miserably, and now, of course, the people hate capitalism because it really did not work for them. primarily because the foundation for capitalism was never given them.
Exactly, and they aren't even aware of that probably for the most part.
No, they're not aware of that.
I would think they don't. They have no idea that they're missing a critical component of that.
Yes.
One thing that
most people here in the United States don't understand it either. It's really a shame we have lost that. Ironically, if you go back and you look at the documents of the Founding Fathers when they were supporting the Constitution or writing for other reasons, they understood the power of private property. They didn't spell it out quite exactly the same way, but they basically said that without private property rights, you cannot have liberty. Literally cannot have liberty, and you cannot create wealth.
Well, I noticed one of the things I was reading or heard in one of the speeches you had given on your website. You talked about how all United Nations treaties, the state controls the property in all of the United Nations treaties.
Right. That's one of the foundational principles of the United Nations that was well established in the early 1970s during Habitat 1, the Habitat 1 conference in Stockholm. And they basically have basically wrote every treaty since that time with the idea that the government controls the use of land, all private property. And they basically justified it on the basis that they must control land because nobody else is smart enough to do it the way it should be done and to actually build the homes and so forth necessary for all people. And, of course, that's what the progressive movement here in the United States has leaned heavily on, is the same philosophy that we need to have government control over all private property and so forth. It's built in with so many of the new things that have been coming out over the last year and a half, well, actually the last 30 years, but especially the last year and a half, that private property should be controlled by the government. I've written another book, it's not published yet, of a woman down in the Portland, Maine area who basically had her land attacked by the town, the local town, city, in order for her, or to get it for practically nothing. They used these smart growth concepts right from the United Nations, this Agenda 21, as you were talking about in the announcement of the program earlier on, that really stripped her basically of all of her rights and land, and there was nothing that she could do about it. And that is one of the dangers, the horrible dangers of this mentality. If the government controls all private property rights, then the government can do to whomever it wants to and tell whoever they want to what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, and the person has no recourse to fighting it.
Buddy, we're back, and you are listening to The Unsolicited Opinion, and we are speaking with Dr. Micheal Coffman, and we are discussing his new book, Rescuing a Broken America, Why America is Deeply Divided, and we were just starting to discuss the United Nations Agenda 21, Sustainable Development. Dr. Coffman, you had mentioned that a global elite is behind this effort to collapse the constitutional government of the U.S. Who are these people, and why have they been so successful in hiding their role? And one of the names that has come to in a lot of things that I've read has been the Rockefeller family.
Yeah, that's correct. They played a principal role in establishing the cartel here in the United States and tied it into what's going on in Europe and so forth. They have played probably a little bit lesser role here in recent history, although they're still very much involved, especially David Rockefeller, even though I think he's close to 90 years old now. He's still very active, involved in doing this. But George Soros and others like him are really pressing to collapse the monetary system of the United States, capitalism, and institute a socialist form of government here in the United States. I know that's a big statement to make, but it's almost perfectly obvious to anyone who looks out and sees what's going on right now. It's hard to really not see it. You really have to try not to see it to realize, to think that it's not happening.
Well, I think that's been one of the problems in this country, Dr. Coffman, is people have refused to believe what's right in front of their eyes. And the proof that's right there in front of them, they just are like ostriches with their head in the sand. They just don't want to see the truth.
That's very true. But during the break we were talking, and you indicated that you had never really fully understood what sustainable development